morning, Esty.
Good morning.
So today we're going to be talking about vulnerability. And I think, we had kind of a funny week this week because when we thought about talking about vulnerability, you and I, we did this funny interaction where you would say something and I'd stop you in the middle and be like, does that feel vulnerable? And then you'd stop me and be like, well, is that vulnerable? And we were sort of testing each other to see what felt vulnerable for one another. And I was kind of shocked because what I thought you were saying was vulnerable was actually not for you. And what you thought wasn't vulnerable for me was actually very vulnerable for me. And so that was a really interesting start of our vulnerability journey towards preparing for this podcast.
Yeah, what to me felt like vulnerability didn't feel like for you and vice versa. So I think it taught us that people just have a different concept of what vulnerability feels like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's different ways of what it feels like, and also just different measurements.
Right.
I see this sometimes with friends where they'll say I'm so vulnerable, and I don't feel it. I don't feel like they're really sharing much with me. I don't feel that connected to them. But I also have those that on the one hand they feel like they're not vulnerable, but for them it actually is.
Right.
I've been talking about this the whole week. The whole week I went over to every single person and I'm like, so what do you think about vulnerability? It was interesting because when I brought it up, everybody wanted to talk about it.
Right.
It wasn't don't talk about it, don't bring it up. It was interesting to everybody about vulnerability.
Well, I think the culture has really shifted, and I think we are shying away less from the stigma of vulnerability, but we might be, let's say, interpreting it in the wrong way or using it the wrong way. But I definitely think, at least personally for me, but again, we're in the social work field, so it's a little different, our measurements than the rest of the world. But, when I saw Brene Brown's video on vulnerability, I don't know how many years ago did it come out?
A while.
That was a new concept. And it was oh my goodness, this is so amazing. But since then, I feel like everybody's heard her videos 100 times and her podcasts and her TED Talks and other people talk about vulnerability. And I feel like we're no longer looking at vulnerability with shame. At least I'm not.
Right.
But we are seeing a lot of this kind of fake vulnerability.
Yes.
Where people are I'm so vulnerable, and a lot of on the Instagram and showing themselves crying, and that just makes me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I don't feel like that's vulnerability. I think vulnerability is something that is felt, and maybe we should define vulnerability. But I think it became a fad to be vulnerable. It's the cool thing. You're not gonna be listened to on Instagram unless you share a story that feels personal. But then when I listen to it, it doesn't feel personal. There's certain things that we don't want to know or we shouldn't be knowing, and that doesn't make it vulnerable. I think vulnerable is a unique category.
Right.
Vulnerable is something that it's emotions, but you have to actually feel it. It's what, sort of vulnerability is the opposite of perfection.
Right.
Because you're actually showing yourself, you're taking a risk, but if you're not taking a risk, it's not vulnerable.
Right.
The person has to feel like they're taking that risk.
It's having courage and feeling brave to stand up for your thoughts, your feelings, what you believe in without worrying about how you're going to look and how you're going to be perceived.
Right. And you might be perceived in a certain way, but you don't necessarily care because you say, this is me and this is how I feel. And I'm willing to take that leap of faith in the hope of connecting.
Right.
And ultimately, when we're more vulnerable, we are more connected. But, on social media, a lot of times, it gives that facade of feeling like it is connected or feeling like it's personal. But in reality, it isn't. You have the ability to cover up and to share what you want to share. And it's been scripted. And so it doesn't really, on the one hand, it's it appears to be, but it really isn't.
Right. Also, vulnerability is not about sharing all your private details of your life and crying to the world on Instagram. It's about
that's socially inappropriate.
Right.
Just crying to the world. If anything, that turns you more into a victim rather than vulnerable. I
Right.
think those two share a lot in common.
Well, when you're being vulnerable, it's really important to decide who you're sharing your story with.
Yeah.
And to make sure that person is a safe person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that you really trust them, that it's going to land on them well, and also that they're not going to hurt you with it.
Right. I mean, sometimes there is the aspect of taking the risk, but ultimately it goes back to that trust, that you have to trust that person that you're being vulnerable with. And it's not just out for the world. Let me just be vulnerable to whoever's listening.
I think it's always a risk. With vulnerability, if there's no risk, then it's not vulnerable.
Right.
It has to be something raw. It has to be emotions that weren't necessarily processed or something that is a bit more private for you or that you wouldn't necessarily share with the world. Because if it's something that's public, it's not then vulnerable.
Right. I guess that's where I find myself struggling with this podcast sometimes about being vulnerable, because it's not choosing a safe person to talk to. It is airing it out and not knowing who's going to listen to.
Right. And so that's why we're more careful.
Right.
And so,
but I'm saying whenever we kind of talk backstage about pushing ourselves to be more vulnerable,
right.
That's on this platform. That's what's stopping me.
Yeah. I think because one of our goals at the beginning was to say can we show people what vulnerability looks like? And can we show people authenticity? And it's almost can that even be shown?
Right.
Because the
on
whole
such a public platform.
Right, and such a public platform, because like a whole point of vulnerability is that it's intimate and is that it's in privacy and that it's between two people or three people, but not that it's just like aired for the whole world, because then there has to be a certain image that's put out or it has to be filtered down a bit. So it's, on the one hand, we want that, but can we really fully do it? And I don't think so.
Right.
Even though we're going to try to.
Right. Well, try as much as like is appropriate for a social
Right.
media platform or for a public platform.
Right. Right.
But
yeah.
ultimately, it won't be the same as what's happening behind cameras when we talk.
Right. Which
It
is a
can't be.
shame. Which is a shame, because I think like on the one hand, like we're talking about vulnerability from like a definition perspective or like from stories, but like to show somebody how to be vulnerable is very different. Like to see it happening and to
Right.
feel it and to be in it is very different than us like talking about the topic of vulnerability.
Right.
And I almost like wish like we can like do like a role play or like for us to like sit and like show people like this is what it feels like and this is what it looks like, rather than just like explaining, because explaining is talking to the logic. It's not like
Right.
talking to the emotion.
Right. And everybody's emotions in terms of vulnerability looks different also. So some people would be like, oh, wow, that, even if we did do this imaginary role play, some people would be like, oh, wow, that was so vulnerable. That really impacted me. And other people would be like, oh, that didn't feel vulnerable.
Exactly. It's like, it's funny because like this week I was like sitting and thinking a lot about like what you and I had discussed about, for me to tell a story, it feels vulnerable. Just to tell anything about my life like feels vulnerable, because I generally don't feel the need to talk or to share, let alone feelings. Like that's only going to be for very close friends or family. But you shared with me that like to tell a story is just like, of course I could tell a story to anybody. Like I'll tell you like what's going on in my day. Like it wasn't a big deal. Whereas like for me, it feels like more of a big deal. Whereas for you to share your emotions, like feels like a bigger deal, like how you feel about something. And so like that was like the difference. And I kept like, circling about that. And I even like asked a couple of my friends, so like, how do you think about that? And one of my friends said to me like, don't you dare ever ask me about my day. And I was like, ask you about your day? Like, that's so simple. Like, what'd you do today? And she was like, no, that feels really vulnerable for me, because like in my past, like people would always say like, what are you doing? Like, what's going on in your day? Like, did you do enough? Like, why are you doing this? Like there was constant like questioning. So that became like a shameful area. And because it's shameful, therefore it feels more vulnerable when anybody asks her about it, because she feels like she's going to be attacked.
Interesting.
Which is kind of interesting, like how our vulnerable areas come out. And a lot of the times, like I think it has to do more with shame.
Yes.
Because generally, like when we're vulnerable, like what are we saying? We're showing parts of ourselves that are not necessarily perfect. We're showing parts of ourselves that we might not like, that we know other people might not like.
There's parts of ourselves that have shame.
There's parts of ourselves, yeah. Yeah. And those parts of ourselves, like to present it to the
and
public.
And what's that antidote to shame? According to Brene Brown, the antidote to shame is sharing it with someone and somebody meeting you with empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Empathy is the antidote to shame.
Yeah.
So you being vulnerable and sharing parts of ourselves that are shameful and having that be met with empathy takes away the shame.
Yeah.
And that's why being vulnerable with the right people is so important, because if not, you're living in that shame on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way to let the shame go is to meet with somebody with empathy.
Yeah. It's making me think of the first time that I cried to a friend. Was not until like after I was married. Like I would never cry in front of everybody. And just like one night I was on the phone with a friend and I just was going through something and I just like completely broke down. I was so embarrassed, that like how could somebody see me in this way? And afterwards, like I got off the phone and I felt so amazing, like that I was able to like show that part to her and like she received it so well. And like afterwards, like I remember just like thanking her for the entire week, which is also a problem. Like it should have just been a given of like, of course she could do this. But like for me, like being able to show that imperfect side or that pain with it being met in a nice way, like it felt really good. And I think like that sort of like opened up the way for me to be able to do it more with other people.
Right, because it was received well and you realized that it's good to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads to good feelings.
Yeah. And then, but to add to that, like on the one hand, like vulnerability, I think like is associated with like our negative parts of like our flaws. I find also that like sometimes it's hard to be vulnerable in terms of like being too happy. Like being too happy could be vulnerable.
Right.
Like
also, like I feel like in our community, like the concept of Iron Hara, of having like a bad eye.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to share like your, keep it quiet, good things come in privacy. All that leads to like, oh, I don't want to tell people that I'm going away on vacation, or that, let's say, a spouse is doing well at work, or any of that stuff, because there is shame associated with it.
Right. Like don't be too good, or don't have too much good going on, because then people are going to like, be jealous, or they're going to look at it and in some way like it might be taken away from you also.
Right. There's a concept of the fear of like, will it be taken away if I flaunt it too much? Yeah, I think, but I think that interestingly though, there is shame that comes up with like
Being too
all
good.
the good stuff, you know, going on.
I think so too, because like that's like we are hardwired to be told like don't be too good, because if you're too good no one's going to like you, because they're going to either be jealous of you or it's not possible for to be too good. Like it's almost like I used to like think this way as a kid of like if it's too good expect something bad to happen because it can never be too good.
Right.
So it's almost like walking that tightrope of like, okay, I'm enjoying it now, but there's gonna be a cliff soon.
Yeah.
That's a very scary way to like be taught of how to go through life. But I think like that's like the aspect of like it's not gonna be good forever. But also like don't share that it's so good because then people will be upset with you. Like
Yeah,
nobody
like
likes too positive.
When I recently went away on vacation, my kids were staying by my in-laws, and I was telling my babysitter of my baby like, oh, she's not going to come on Friday because she's going to my in-laws. And she's like, oh, why? And like I told her that I was going away, and I saw on her face that she was a little bit jealous. And like it hurt me so much that I caused that, because I don't know what's going on in her life. And I did feel bad. So I was like, should I have not said anything? But I had to tell her that my baby wasn't coming the next day. And then she's like, oh, why? And it was just like, you know, and I remember feeling really bad about that.
Yeah. Because it's almost like you don't want the other person to feel like they're missing out in their life.
Right.
Like I get that a lot where, you know, I know if I went on vacation or if something good has happened, I'm scared to tell people because I don't want them then to be like, oh, like, you know, she gets this and I don't.
Right.
Like, can they either be happy for me? And I think like, you know, even if they could be happy for me, like I'm not scared that they won't be happy. I'm more scared that it's going to hurt them because they're going to compare it to their own lives. And when they compare it to their own lives, they're going to say, I'm not meeting those expectations. Like I'm not doing that. Like, and like there's that compare and contrast process that we all do with one another. And I don't want to be the one who's causing somebody else to have to compare it to themselves and then feel bad about themselves.
Exactly. I don't want someone to feel bad. And I think that, you know, it maybe goes back to the concept of like even the good things, like share with the people that you trust and that you know care about you and love you. Like I remember my sister once got a new bracelet and like I didn't notice it. It was really nice. And I was like, oh my goodness. And like she covered her shirt. And I was like, why are you hiding that from me? Like I was so offended. I was like, I'm so happy for you that you got a new bracelet. I'm like, when did you even get it? Like I would have expected a snap of a picture the second she got it. And for some reason she didn't feel comfortable to share that she had gotten this new piece of jewelry. And to me that hurt that she didn't feel comfortable. And I think that like, again, even with the good things in our life, being vulnerable to share those exciting new news that's happening, things that you're looking forward to but didn't happen yet. That's really scary to share because what if it doesn't happen?
Right.
What if it does happen? I mean, people are very secretive, let's say, about buying a new house, right? People get very secretive, and I'm not in that stage yet. So I'm always like, why are people so secretive about it? Like, I don't get it. In general, I'm not very secret. I'm not a secretive person at all.
Not at all.
So I like get confused. I'm like, what's secretive about it? Now, I understand, like one of my friends, like good things come in private, right? Ayin hara, all those concepts. So that there is some real truth to that, right? So that is something to be mindful of. I wonder if there's more though. I think
there's more. I think that, you know, there is the shame involved. And I think also that people don't want anybody else like looking in their pocket. Like for me, like some of the times that I don't share is also because like I don't want it to be spoken about until it actually happens, because what if it doesn't happen? And then I don't want to have to like explain it.
Right.
So I had like, you know, some friends who they had broken engagements. And like one of the hardest pieces was after getting engaged and telling everybody that they were engaged, when they broke it off, they had to backtrack and tell everybody that they weren't engaged.
Yeah, I remember that when I was dating, like people, like I would tell my friends, oh, I'm dating someone, and then it ended and I'd have to like go and call everybody. And I was like, this is just not worth it. You know?
It's funny because I was the opposite extremes, that I never told anybody anything when it got serious. I would tell all my friends like my funny dating stories like as I was going there, because I didn't think it was going anywhere.
Right.
So I'm like, sure, no problem. Like I'll tell you my dating stories because I know like there's nothing vulnerable that's ever going to happen from this. And like they're not going to reject me and I'll probably say no and like it's nothing embarrassing. But actually when I dated my husband, I didn't tell anybody. And I kept it so private that my friends even got angry at me afterwards saying like, you didn't tell us?
Right.
Like
friends
we thought we were
people
close.
Get offended when you don't share private things about your life with other people.
Yeah, it's very bad for relationships. Like I learned my lesson. But I was just so scared that what if they find out that I'm dating him, let's say, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 times, then he dumps me and it doesn't work out. Then what? Like, I don't want to look stupid. Like, I don't want to be the girl who like he doesn't want to marry.
So it's back to shame.
So it was back to shame. Or it's sort of like, I don't want to have to tell you a story afterwards. So it's like, when it happens, it happens. Otherwise, like, I'll leave it to myself.
Right. It's so interesting because I remember when I was dating guys, I wouldn't, and I, let's say, didn't find them good looking. I wouldn't want to tell my friend that I didn't find them good looking in case I would end up with them. And then they'd be like, oh, so awkward. She married someone who she didn't think was good looking. And I think that exactly is an example of like shame around vulnerability. Because to be in the, you know, utopian kind of relationship and the utopian vulnerability wouldn't be able to say like, oh, I'm dating this guy now and I'm struggling with how he looks. And then eventually if it grows on you or or other reasons happen that you feel like that is more powerful than the looks, that to be able to be vulnerable and be like, yeah, there wasn't something that attracted to me at first, but I'm at the place where I still want to marry that person. That takes strength.
Yeah.
But instead, we choose to just not tell people that part of ourselves,
right,
because we don't want people to know that we felt that way.
I think there's also like the assumption that like people will come back and point fingers and be like, oh, you see? Or, you know, you said this, like what's going on now? Or like later on, let's say you're not attracted anymore and you'll say, oh, that's why you told me when you were dating, like you knew it when you were dating. And it's almost like we don't want to get hurt by it. Like I see that a lot of times, like even with clients, like they'll come in and like, you know, because I deal a lot with like those that are like dating and like post-marriage. And like a lot of times they don't tell their friends those things, which I think is smart not to tell their friends necessarily. Because let's say you do fight with your husband about something later on that's connected. Like you don't want your friends necessarily to know something so personal. I don't know, because like it's a hard balance, because on the one hand you do want them to know personal but not too personal. Like there's certain things they don't need to know. Like do they need to know like how attracted you are? Like I don't know if that might be personal or not personal for one person versus another. Or do they need to know like, you know, the critiques that you necessarily have? Like eventually they might know the fights or the arguments, like because like, you know, everybody needs a friend to vent to.
I think there is a concept of not everyone needs to know everything and to know who to trust, but I think there are certain things that would be very releasing if we were. So let's say like people when they're pregnant. It's a big thing not to tell people in the beginning, right? People wait till like 3 months. Again, back to the Ayanhara and good things come in secret and a baby's life is more at risk before 3 months. All those things. I know that I personally was very, very sick in my first trimester. So I did tell more people. I had to. It was like, it was like obvious. So it was just like to pretend, like to lie. I'm like, I'm not pregnant. Like, what was I doing? So I did tell people. And I remember one person who I told, and her answer was so nice. She's like, yeah, like I also had a friend that told me, she's like, really early on, she's like, this is the time that we need the support.
Right.
She's like, instead, people are just struggling, being sick, alone, and nobody knows, so they're not getting help from their family and friends with their other kids or work. She's like, this is the time. It is the time. And yeah, of course, you're not going to shout it at the world because there is a concept of being private. But me being able to take away the shame, I felt shame to share people so early because it's like socially off because it's so early in my pregnancy. But I took away the shame because I knew that I needed my friends and my family's support during that time. And I told a few people, not everyone, I told a few people, and therefore I had so much support. But if I would have been like, oh, we don't tell people before 3 months, I would have struggled alone.
Right.
And I think that sometimes even making the decision of like, are you attracted to this guy or are you not attracted to this guy? Sometimes if you keep that to yourself, you're struggling in that shame alone of like, I don't know if I'm attracted to him. I don't know if I'm not. And then, yeah, you might get over and you might decide to marry him. And like, yay, lucky you. No one has to know that you were ever not attracted to him. But to take that step of vulnerability with one person that you feel safe, that will never use it against you and will never share it and be like, listen, I really like the guy that I'm dating, but I'm really struggling here if I'm attracted to or not. Can I talk it out to you what that means? Yeah, you're trusting someone that someone's going to have this information potentially about your husband for the rest of their life.
Right.
But you're also knowing who you're telling that story to. You're not shouting it to the world. You're not writing it on Instagram like, hey, not sure if I'm attracted to the guy I'm dating.
Let's take a poll.
Exactly. Let's take a poll. No, you're choosing a safe person and you're being vulnerable. You're having the courage to face a fear that you're going through and have someone guide you through it.
Yeah. And I think the key piece in what you said is that it has to be that one person that you trust. Like,
yeah,
it's not out for the whole world.
People.
Like, it's not 10 people. Like, even
it's
maybe it's 2 people, right? Because, you know, one person might not be enough. You might want a second opinion, but they're trustworthy people. They're those that are not going to use it against you. They're those that are wise, that could actually help you in this specific area rather than just like, what does the world think? Or what do my friends think? And sometimes friends can be helpful and sometimes not.
Right. You have to know with which situation who's the person to go to. And sometimes you don't need someone. Sometimes you're fine on your own.
Right.
But yeah, you're always taking that risk when you're being vulnerable with somebody that they're going to have this information. But sometimes you need it in that moment. And it's important to honor that.
Right. And there's nothing necessarily dangerous about them knowing about your husband for the rest of their life with this. Like, you know, sometimes like we're so scared, we protect ourselves so strongly that we don't actually then get helped. Like we're so scared of being vulnerable. So therefore we're suffering instead.
Right.
And, you know, we have to stop protecting ourselves and instead take that leap of faith in the hope of making it better.
Yeah, I think it also like normalizes certain things that they're not as shameful as you think they are by keeping it private.
Exactly. Like this is something we can talk about. It's not a big deal.
Right. I think that certain concepts we think are more shameful than they are. And if we meet someone where they're at and not where they're at, if we share the story with somebody else, they could be like, oh, wow, I felt the same way. Like, here's how my story worked out. Like, here's how I can help you get through your struggles. And it's not like, oh, it's a shameful, you know, nobody needs to know. And I keep going back to this like example of like being attracted to guys when you're dating, because I think that for me that was like a really big thing. Like I wouldn't share that with people if I wasn't attracted in case I would end up marrying that guy.
Right.
And like, what if we took away the stigma of like, oh, it's so shameful to not be physically attracted to the guy that you're dating? Maybe so many more people are struggling with that concept. Like, should I marry him? Should I not? But everyone's keeping that a secret because they don't want anyone to know that they weren't physically attracted. And how did it work out for you? How did it not? How did you know when to, to stop dating? How did you know to continue dating and to try? And then the physical attraction grew. Like so much by sharing our story, do we destigmatize the myths that we're holding about those concepts and learn so much more.
Yeah. I think like, though the topics on the one hand, like there's certain like communal topics that are like shameful to talk about, but then there's like other topics that like are more personal that we wouldn't necessarily know is shameful or vulnerable for them to speak about. So like, let's say like attraction, like I think like as a general whole, like that's not something that's spoken about, like that comes with like a certain element of shame. But there's other things like, let's say that story that I said earlier where asking somebody about their day, like I did not think that was personal. Right. Like what'd you do today? Like an accounting of somebody's day, like that doesn't feel like it's vulnerable in any which way.
And even for her to tell you that, don't ask me about that. That was
the vulnerability. Exactly.
Like, this for me is shameful.
Yeah.
Because why would you think that it's shameful?
Exactly. I think there's some people though who are so good at speaking vulnerably, so it appears vulnerable, but it's actually not vulnerable. And like, there was a post that actually a colleague of ours, I don't know if you read it, she put a post up about like her life circumstances, and everybody like responded back like, wow, that's so vulnerable, so nice of you to share. And she was like, I don't get it, like I was really not vulnerable, like that was not like close to my heart at all, like it was not raw, like it was just something that happened to me, and not something that I'm still like struggling with. And I think like those types of people automatically like bring in connection because people feel more connected to them because they know how to talk vulnerably, they know how to write vulnerably, they know how to share a story vulnerably. But oftentimes like what happens is that like it's a confusing relationship to be in because you think you're close to them but they don't feel close to you.
Right.
And that can happen like also like in dating or in relationships with friends where you think that you're closer or you think you're farther ahead than you actually are, and so like it's mismatched, and then you might be like taking the leap when in reality they're not holding there.
Right.
And so it's confusing.
Yeah, I think sometimes you look at someone like how they are with all their other relationships. Like I'm thinking about someone like that I'm like, oh wow, like are we such good friends? Like they're so open, they're so vulnerable. And then I realize that's just who they are as a person. They'll talk to any stranger like that.
Right. And then it doesn't even feel like unique. Like the whole thing about vulnerability is like, I know something about you that maybe nobody else knows. Or like I got to know you a little bit better, because you're deeper and there's like lots of parts to you, and I got to know a private part. It's almost like, wow, like I feel like I'm getting to know you slowly and like I know more about you, and that like brings a certain closeness. But then it's like, oh, everybody knows this. Like it doesn't feel as like unique. It's sort of like,
is it vulnerable if everybody knows it? I mean, it could be someone shares something vulnerable with everybody. Could be. You're making the face like, nah.
I don't.
It could be. It just because somebody's being vulnerable and doing it the wrong way doesn't not make it vulnerable.
Right. So I guess like, we really have to go back to like defining like what is vulnerable, and like maybe like there's a difference between like vulnerable and authentic. Like authentic is like just being real, and like vulnerable is about sharing.
In order to be vulnerable, you have to be authentic, right?
Yes.
Because it's a vulnerability if it's not real. No. So there has to be authenticity in order for it to be vulnerable.
But I think like we can share things that are not vulnerable, but they're authentic. Like I can tell a story about my day. It's authentic, but is it vulnerable? Like not necessarily. It could be it's like a ready
vulnerable
process.
Is kind of like going into authentic. I feel like is like the way of like living your true self, being real, being honest. And vulnerable, I feel like is going deeper into that authenticity. But you have to be authentic first.
Right. Vulnerable like has the element of taking the leap, and the risk,
and going into a raw, deeper place, which is not appropriate for all the time and with everyone. And I think we keep repeating that. Like vulnerability is something that can be, I think, really magical in your life if you add that in, if you are talking to the right person and sharing appropriate things. But that doesn't mean like now just go out on the street, be vulnerable at work, go be vulnerable to all the strangers. Like there's a time and a place, and also about what content.
I think there's like also like layers of vulnerability. So there's just like sharing a story, right? That's like, one level of like what happened in your day. Right. And then afterwards there's going a little bit deeper and saying, well, this is how I felt. Right. And after that level of like, this is how I felt, there's then the raw emotions. Like, those times where like you're feeling something or I'm feeling something in the moment and like, I don't even know what I'm feeling. And it's just like, it's all over the place. It's chaos. Like, it's just like, well, what's going on? You might be crying, like, trying to figure it out, angry. All the emotions are like up in the air. Like that's like extreme extreme vulnerability, like to reach out to somebody at that point and to say like, I don't really know what's going on with me. Like, I feel like I'm a mess.
Right.
Like, and sometimes like we don't necessarily reach out to people when we're in that place, like, because number one, we might not have the person, or number two, like we don't want to put that on a person, or number three, we might be internal processors. Like sometimes like when we're in that place, I know for myself, like when I'm in that place of like a complete just like emotional mess, what I need to do is I need to be alone in order to figure it out, either journal, write it through, or just think it through, or go on a walk and like process my thoughts. And then only afterwards can I share it with somebody, because like otherwise it won't make sense.
Right. I think for me, like what shows me that I'm doing something wrong is like when I'm sharing it with too many people. That means like I'm staying stuck with something and I can't figure something out. So I'll try this person, and then I'll talk to a different good friend, and then I'll talk to my mother, and then I'll talk to my husband, and then another good friend. And I'm like, I'm spinning the same cycle, and I'm saying the same story, but I'm not getting anywhere where I'm trying to get. That's when I'm like, okay, I need to pause. I need to take a break, and I need to find out what's going on within me if I feel the need to say it so many times.
Because like you're waiting for the right response, the right answer, the right awareness, and
exactly.
nobody's
giving it to
up.
me, and I kind of get like a broken telephone, you know?
Yeah. And, and I think like some people like need to think for themselves, and some people like are though external processors where they need other people to help them figure out what they're feeling.
Yeah.
Like, because they can't figure it out on their own.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think for me, it's very interesting that like sometimes if I have a lot going on and I'm trying to figure something out, I need to talk to somebody who doesn't know the story at all, so I can start from the beginning, right? So someone who's in my family or close friend circle, like they might know the story already, because let's say it's something at work, right? They might know everyone at work and what goes on at work, and I need to like start from scratch. Like, let me write you a diagram, okay, to explain what's going on. So sometimes I have to find a friend, out of town who I haven't spoken to in a little bit, but is a very close friend I'm like, okay, listen to this out. Now help me make this solution, or what I'm supposed to do next, Right.
It's kind of funny because like I have no patience for that. Like it's sort of like whoever knows, and like let's just like keep up. We experienced it together, so let's talk about it. And like someone who doesn't know, like you're just not gonna get it. Like it's like, so I need there's to, way too many details to share.
Because I feel like someone who knows sometimes like they have all their biases already based on other things that I said.
Right.
And like I need to like clean the slate. So I need to talk to someone who doesn't understand. So I can also I guess I'm more of an external thinker, so I can like think it out. I need to like explain it all from the beginning.
Right. Yeah. And it's almost like a clean slate. Like they don't know anything about it, and like you can get like an outsider's opinion.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like, yeah, no, I'm definitely an inside processor, like internal processor, like close the door, like think myself, and then like I'll deliver it to you. Like I love like the analogy of like on the one hand, like when we're talking, like sometimes like we can be giving fresh food, or we can like be giving leftovers. Like, are you like giving somebody your Shabbos leftovers where you just like said it over and over and over again? It's like it's kind of burnt, like it doesn't feel so good. But like when you have fresh food, it tastes amazing. And like that's like my like key way of saying like am I saying something new, or is this just something that like I'm giving over? And like it feels kind of like hard to be in a conversation with somebody where I'm just like telling a story, but like it's not actually like something new, or nothing is like building on it. Like here, like let's say we're speaking, right? I feel like you're building on what I'm saying, and so like it's bringing me new awarenesses like as we're talking. Whereas like if I'm just like speaking and like you give me a typical response, or the other person gives me like a typical response, I'm like, okay, like I know what's coming next, you know what's coming next. Like there's something nice about like the shock element of I don't know what you're thinking, and I don't know what you're going to be saying, and that's going to make me think more. And I think like that's also like an element of vulnerable, where I'm telling you a new idea or a new story, and like you're going to respond to it and you're going to build on it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting concept.
Yeah. But then again, like that makes me think that vulnerability is not necessarily like sharing our deepest, darkest secrets. Sometimes like vulnerability is like calling somebody up and saying like, hey, do you want to go out? Yeah. Or I'm bored, you want to go for pizza? Or this happened today, like what do you think about it? Or I had this wonderful idea, like, or this nice thing happened to me. Like it's not necessarily like all of our bad parts.
Yeah, I mean, like for me, like when I moved to the new neighborhood for the first time, like being vulnerable was asking people to go out and making friends at my age, that does take vulnerability. Ask someone to come over for a Shabbos meal or go on a walk or something.
Yeah. Or to, go to their house or...
Right. I think that, like, I remember that concept so strongly that, like, if I feel it from someone else, like someone new or someone's trying, like, I try to reciprocate that really, because I remember that feeling of, like, being vulnerable or reaching out. So if I feel like someone's trying to reach out to me, like, I try not to be, like, nonchalant about it. Like, oh, sure. Like, I try to really give, like, an engaging response to it, because I know how hard that must have been based on my own feelings.
Right.
Might have not been hard for them.
Right. We don't know. Like,
exactly.
And, like, the thing with vulnerability is, like, if people would talk about it, like, then we would know what's vulnerable and what's not vulnerable. But, like, oftentimes, like,
but it's not socially appropriate to be like, this is really vulnerable for me, but do you want to go on a walk? Or do our kids want to have a play date? Like,
right. Exactly. It's sort of like you have to, like, sense it and feel it and be smart about it and just, like, go about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of times vulnerability isn't said that someone's being vulnerable, but it's like the questions they're asking, the stories they're saying, or the expression on their face. And like as a receiver of that, as like a friend of that, we have to be open and aware that people might be vulnerable with us in order to receive it well, in order to give that mutual relationship, because they're not going to phrase it on being vulnerable.
Right.
And, think about how many times somebody was, I'm sure it wasn't personal, but they're nonchalant and it might have really offended you,
Exactly.
if you reached out in a vulnerable way and they weren't receptive of it.
Yeah, I'm trying to like, process like what it means to be like the receiver of vulnerability. Like rather than like being vulnerable,
Right.
like also like what if someone's vulnerable with me? Like how do I respond to that? And
Right.
I like what you said before, about the empathy, because that was like a really good reminder of like we all need to respond to vulnerability with empathy. But also like how to be a good listener to it and how to like identify like the emotion in it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I have one friend who's very good about articulating her feelings and her words, and you don't always realize when someone's being vulnerable, and you can make a sarcastic joke, like you're trying to be funny.
Goodness, yes.
And I have one friend who will call me out on that and be like, "Wait, no, I'm being honest here. I'm being raw here." And that's like amazing, because it's like, okay, great. Right. Or like, no, this is not funny. Like, let's not make a joke about that. But most of the time people aren't saying that. So they're just feeling that hurt inside. And you don't realize how many times, like, and I'm not saying that means that we should be watching our words. I guess just like maybe look out for the cues that someone's trying to be vulnerable instead of like responding back flippantly, nonchalantly, making a joke.
Yeah, that's like really making me think. Like I realized lots of times when we're vulnerable, we joke about it or we're sarcastic. Like we can't just be like, this is my raw emotions. Like we kind of like mock ourselves or we want to like turn it into like some humorous story. Like I know I do that all the time where it's like I'm telling something that has happened. Really, there's such like deep pain about it or like such like confusion or like something vulnerable that's there. But instead, like I'll tell it in like the funniest way, and everyone is extremely like laughing. But like that's the only way like I feel comfortable like sharing that. Rather than actually like going and saying it in that vulnerable way. So like humor is actually like a way of hiding.
It's a way of hiding
vulnerability, but it's also like I think like a socialized way of getting out hard things.
Right, because people don't want to hear you complaining and crying, but they'll take a funny dating story. They don't want to hear how miserable you were on a 4-hour date, but they'll hear how funny that the guy kept you out for 4 hours when you were miserable.
Yes.
Laugh. So yeah, people are more receptive to hear that story, and then you're able to share your story. But sometimes there's still the pain that's left if it's not met with enough empathy when you share it in a funny way. Because nobody knows to give empathy when you're laughing at it.
Right, exactly. And like also like there can like feel judgment. And I'll give like a personal example. You remember last week when I was telling you that story about like hosting and like, how it was so funny and like the smashed bananas like in my carpet and all that stuff. So on the one hand, like I was sharing that story, and when I was telling it like in a funny way, not to you, because obviously you respond empathetically.
Thank you.
But when I was telling it elsewhere, like I remember like feeling so judged. And I was like, why am I feeling so judged? Like, there's nothing wrong with the story that I'm saying. And it's a funny story. So like, why are people judging me? And I don't know if I was being judged or I felt judged. Right. And maybe like my own like, feelings of like, I should host, or I should be okay with my house being dirty, or I should be okay with smashed bananas, or I can clean it up anyways, or I should be like, more okay in some way with this, or I shouldn't have these feelings. But like, I remember like when I was telling the story, I felt so judged of like, oh, like this is not the way that you should be. And I was like, afterwards, like, I'm like, oh my goodness, like I didn't even share it vulnerably because I was using humor, and still the shame came out. Right. And still I was feeling that shame, and I felt like so gross afterwards of, I shouldn't have made that joke, or I shouldn't have told people how I felt about that Shabbos, or I shouldn't have told people about how I feel about cleanliness, or like, that I need things to be very, very clean, because like, what are they going to think about that? Or is that judgment? And like, as I'm sitting now, like I'm thinking about it, I don't even know if it's necessarily like, what are other people going to think? I think it's just my own insecurities about like my own shame of how do I feel about needing a very, very clean house, or how I feel about like needing space.
So you were sharing something vulnerable in the terms of like comedy, and you still felt judged.
Yeah.
And that left you with like a bad feeling afterwards.
Right. Because I think I was judging myself, I think, more than anything. But it could be other people were judging me too.
Yeah. And I think comedy is like a way that we mask our shame.
Yeah. It definitely is. Like, it feels a little bit lighter. Also, it's sort of like testing of like, how will people take this? Like, so can you handle it a bit? Like, are they laughing?
Right.
Like, if they're laughing, it's like, okay, like they can handle it. Like, maybe that means they can relate to it. Like, and sometimes like I'll throw in a line of saying like, oh, I feel so terrible for saying this. Or is it so bad that I'm saying this?
Right.
And that's also like another way of like testing. Yeah. Like, where am I? Like, how can you handle this? Like, can I go a little bit deeper? Like, can I say my true feelings? Right. So it's like, we're always doing that like consciously and unconsciously.
Wow.
Yeah. But I think like it's interesting because like on the one hand, like with empathy, when I share a story and somebody's empathetic, like it feels good. But I think what feels better is when the other person comes and shares an exact story that they have that's also vulnerable. So it's not necessarily the same exact story, but it's something that it reminds them of.
Right.
And therefore, we're like on even playing field.
It's funny because sometimes I'm so conscious to not stay a story back because, like, you know, those, like, I feel like we were always taught, like, don't, like, one-up someone's story.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So, like, I want to sometimes, like, be there for someone, like, in their story and in their feelings. And I don't want to be like, oh, yeah, I also have the same thing.
Right.
And, like, sometimes when people do it to me, like, it actually, sometimes I like it, but, like, sometimes I get nervous from it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm not, like, done explaining my story. Mm-hmm. I'm not ready to jump onto your story.
Right. I think it's like, you know, knowing how to read the situation. But, you know, in the beginning, you're right. Because it's like, okay, no, you can't relate to me. Like, your story is not relatable to me. It's like, we just sit with me for a minute.
And
like,
even if it is relatable, like, I don't want to hear another story right now. I want to talk about my story.
Exactly. Like, you have to wait until, like, they're finished. But, like, I find that times, like, where I'm done saying my story or somebody else is done saying their story. And then it's like, I empathize, they empathize to, like, now what's next? I think what's next is that they should come and share their own.
That's what takes it deeper.
That's what takes it deeper. Yeah, because it's like, oh, you too? Like, you also get this?
Right.
You know, and maybe not because we're not always going to be similar, but you can get that feeling. Like, it's a story that, like, connects to the emotion that I was feeling. So, like, let's say I was feeling shame, or let's say I was feeling like I needed to use humor. So maybe there was a time that you used humor. Or maybe there was a time where you felt shame that, like, you could connect to it. And, like, I love when someone comes to me and says, like, listen, like, it's not completely related, but, like, you know, it reminds me of this.
Yeah.
And then it also, like, I feel like it's nice to, like, take the attention off myself because, like, it's so hard being vulnerable. And then, like, when someone else comes and says, like, let me also be vulnerable. So it's like, okay, the spotlight's on you, and it doesn't have to be fully on me always. Like, that feels awesome.
Yeah, no, I hear that.
Yeah.
But, like, I'm still struggling with it a little bit because, like, I'm thinking of an example of, like, someone who in my life, like, will always have, like, another story to say, and, like, even to the point that one time they were like, let me think of a story that's similar to that, and I realized what they were doing. It wasn't coming from, like, a one-up. It was coming from, like, this empathetic place, and I was like, oh, in my head I didn't say it, but I was like, oh wow, I don't like that.
Yeah.
So it's funny because, like, when you're saying it, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. I hear that and I feel that. But, like, sometimes I don't like it.
Right. I think, like, it's really, like, dependent on the situation. But, like, sometimes, like, you know, when you said, like, like, what should I add? Like, so on the one hand, like, are they doing that because they want to, like, be involved in the conversation, or are they doing that because they want to tell a story that's going to help you?
It sounded like it was coming from a place of wanting to help.
Right. But just because someone sounds that way, like, is it really that way?
Right. Well.
So, meaning if it's really coming from a place of helping, like, I want to help and I want to share a story, like, I can see how that could be, like, really helpful. But if not, like, it can be like, no, I don't want to hear your story.
Right.
Like,
exactly.
Please, like, you know, keep your story to yourself. But on the topic of, like, stories, like, something that, like, I tell my clients, like, what I find them quite often is, like, you know, as a therapist, like, we're always helping people feel. And we're giving them permission to feel. We're shame busters. And also, like, what we're trying to do is to help them, like, identify the feelings that they're feeling. And something, like, I tell them is, like, I hear your story. I don't hear how you feel. Like, I can sit an entire session with somebody and they tell me hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories. And I'm sitting there, I'm listening and I'm listening, I'm listening. And I'm like, where are your feelings?
Right. Sometimes I'm like, okay, how's this relevant to you? Like, I hear the story, but, like, you didn't come in just to tell me a story about your weekend. Like, what's the point?
Exactly.
And again, I don't necessarily say it that way, but sometimes I'm like, okay, what are you trying to tell me? You know,
we're not that impatient in session,
like,
right?
Come on. No, what's the point of your story already?
It's so funny because even as I say this, I'm like, oh my gosh, it was just so vulnerable that I responded in that way, because I'm like, what if people then think I'm a judgmental therapist? Yeah. Or what if they think that I'm just, like, you know, with the clients, it's like I'm impatient.
Right.
And it's like, it's not. We're using humor right now. Like,
right.
To,
exactly.
Like,
and it's
mellow
not
it down.
that we're impatient. We're trying to help the client get to the point that they're trying to get to. And we know that the story is just is hiding the word, the feelings underneath it.
Yeah. I honestly think that, like, people like humor or comedy, or maybe I just like comedy.
Right.
Like,
well, did you listen to that comedy podcast that I sent you?
No.
Okay. So Brene Brown was interviewing like a big producer of movies, and he does, like, a lot of comedy movies. And he was saying, like, people laugh because it's true. And I like that line. Like, we find it funny because it's true, so we relate to it. Right. So comedy, it might mask some of our shame and some of our feelings, but it also allows us to tell a story that's relatable.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it makes it, like,
and we laugh at it because we realize we do the same thing. Like,
right,
why are those,
agreeing
like,
with it?
Why
when
are
you're
those
laughing,
TikTok,
you're agreeing.
Right? Why are those TikTok videos so funny that you don't realize that everyone else does the same thing?
Right.
Or, like, those, like, people sharing how they feel about something. You're like, oh my god, I feel, and, like, it's just hysterical because you feel exactly the same way.
I'm totally, like, on a tangent here, but it's making me think of, like, what I think is funny. Like, I cannot stand humor where people are just, like, acting dumb for no reason. Like, you know, someone slips on a banana and it's like, why is that funny?
Well, I'm sure people find that funny.
And there are some people that find that funny, but I think, like, maybe the reason I don't find certain things funny is because, like, that would never be true for me.
Could be. Interesting.
Which is interesting. We only find funny what we relate to.
I wonder if that's true. Like, I'm trying to think. I can't think that much on the spot. Like, I'm sure I found things funny that I didn't relate to. We laugh the most by things that are true, like things that are making fun of ourselves, or making fun of mom life, or making fun of husbands, or making fun of kids. Like, those are the kind of things that, like, I'm sure I would have not found that funny when I was a teenager.
Right.
And now I'm, like, on the floor, you know?
Yeah, but, with comedy also, like, as we're laughing, like, it's also empathy. Because if we're saying comedy is that you relate to it.
I hear you too. Right. I find that funny.
Exactly. And so, like, if anything, like, because if we're saying, like, vulnerability needs empathy, but sometimes, like, our vulnerability is masked with humor. And so when someone is laughing. But more than masked,
it might be in a form of comedy.
In a form, right. It's not masked. It's in a form of comedy because, like, that's just easier to digest. When someone then laughs, and not laughs at you, laughs with you, and then like says like, oh, I can relate to this. It's actually quite empathetic. So you're getting the same results, which is quite interesting.
So there is a way to share vulnerability through comedy.
Yeah.
But but I think you have to know the difference. Sometimes we say it in a form of comedy, but sometimes we're masking it because there's a lot of shame. Right. And that I don't think is doing the trick of what you need done in terms of vulnerability. That's a way of testing the waters, like you were saying before, checking how people are going to react to it, doing it in a socially appropriate way. Mm-hmm. That's, to me, doesn't feel like vulnerability. Right. That's a way of checking if you could be vulnerable. Yeah. But sometimes sharing a story of pain in a funny way in order to be able to share it can be vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. And, back to what we were saying before, just about like the client piece, where people are like telling a story, but they're not actually feeling. Like when you can begin to share what you're feeling, it makes the stories more exciting. It makes the stories more connected. And I think like so many of the times, like people feel so lonely or they feel so disconnected is because they're not sharing and because they're not able to share. And it's sad because sometimes they can't share because there really isn't anybody who's not going to judge. Right. There really isn't a safe place for them to go to and to say it. And like they're actually doing the smarter thing by not sharing, which is sad. Right. But ultimately, like if we have that one person or two people or three people, like where we can be vulnerable, like then we can start to say like, this is how I feel about it. Like, and I think like it's this trapped place where I find clients in. They're trapped because on the one hand, they have all these thoughts and all these feelings. It's not that they don't know them and it's not that they can't identify them. Like they know they're there, but they know that there's nowhere where it fits in the world that they've created around themselves or the world that was given to them around themselves. And so it's like bouncing around inside of them. And a lot of times they're like, okay, I need medicine or I need something to help me deal with these thoughts. But really what those thoughts are thoughts of how they feel. And it could be thoughts of shame, or it's sort of like these need to be inner thoughts and they need to stay inner thoughts because the second that they're in public, it's going to be too dangerous or there's no room for my life to like move around with this or to deal with it. And, that's really hard. And me as a therapist, I think I struggle with that a lot of when someone is coming to me, they're trying to get help with being vulnerable or they're trying to get help feeling their feelings or knowing their feelings. But what if they live in an area or in a place that doesn't allow for it? Me teaching them to be vulnerable is actually quite dangerous. Right. And I then come to a certain standstill and I have this conversation and saying like, what I do might not work for where you are. Right. And I don't want to turn everything up and around in your life. Right.
But it might be the therapy session is that they're still learning these skills so that way they can express it in a therapy session. And that could be their space that they could be vulnerable.
Right. And I mean, that's the only place that they can be vulnerable. Right. But then also like once you start tasting vulnerability, you want more. Right. And it's much harder then to live in the surroundings that you're in because you sort of want other people to have it too.
Right. I think that people like one of the famous like knocks against therapists is like therapists like will tell you to break off relationships and I think it's because you're giving them the taste of a healthy relationship and the taste of like what vulnerability looks like, and people then no longer want to be in toxic relationships. They no longer want to be in relationships where they can't be vulnerable anymore, and that's why they start breaking off relationships with different people that they had because they're like, this is not good anymore, I don't want it anymore, I want more when I'm getting in my therapy session. And therefore they start looking for that, but by looking for that they might close off different relationships that they have, and then comes the famous thing like, oh look at this therapist, she's making you not like your friends, and it's like, no, I realize what I need now.
Like you outgrew it. You don't want that type of relationship anymore. You want a different type.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's hard to go on that like journey to find someone that you can be vulnerable and safe with. And one thing that I find that's a little bit sometimes can be like the wrong answer is that people then will sometimes like go to support groups because they're like, oh, it's therapy. So like therapy groups. And like, I think that in the not Jewish community, it's like very accepted that like you come to the group, whatever says there stays there, and outside relationships aren't accepted. But in the Jewish community, a lot of like support groups or skills groups, like people will become friends with other people because it's like so exciting to meet someone who's in the same place as them. And I find that sometimes those relationships can be really toxic. Yeah. Taking a support person and having an outside relationship with them. Sometimes because it labels people as like having the same issue, and then they kind of like their relationship is defined by that.
Yeah, it's
And-
solely on that.
Right. And it starts in a great place where they're like, oh, this is somebody who's in a group with me and I'm being vulnerable with them. So like, let's be friends outside the group. And I haven't seen it working yet.
No, I've also like not seen that working. Like I think like that's like on the one hand, like we have to be vulnerable, but we can't only connect through pain. Like you can
Right.
be vulnerable in other ways and in other areas. Also, like there has to be, like you said earlier, the times where you just like go to the ice cream store and talk about nothing, or just like you have a shared experience, or you're going shopping together, or you're watching your kids together. Like
Right.
it doesn't always have to be like we're always sharing or we're always
Right.
unpacking. Like that, I don't think like that's an extreme, and I don't think that that's healthy either. Like you see this with like they meet with treatments, people who meet others at treatment centers or in rehab, or
Those friendships sometimes, unless that can be the foundation, and then they can start a beautiful friendship.
Right.
But many times it comes. So I would question people from going there to meet those vulnerable friends. I think that's what I see is happening sometimes, that
Right.
people are looking for it. So they're like, oh, this might be a good place to find it. If
Right.
sometimes a friendship comes from it, I can't say that it's never good. I don't know.
Right.
But I wouldn't go there to look for that vulnerable relationship.
Right. I think it might be like a starting point for someone who is like having a hard time with vulnerability to like go to those, like to go to a group and to get
That's-
support. Like
to
we're
go
not
to-
denying that
no,
there's
the groups
extremely
are
like
amazing.
supportive. The groups
But
are
I'm saying
amazing.
to go into those groups to find someone to be a friend outside of the group.
Right. Yeah. It might be hard to like bring them into your other areas of your life.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. And like also like you don't want everything. Like I think like also like that's a hard point of like not everything should be surrounding problems. Like
Right.
not everything should be surrounding, let's say if somebody went through abuse, like your whole life shouldn't be surrounded by abuse. Your whole life shouldn't be surrounded by victimhood.
Right.
Like it shouldn't be like this, the focal point. Like
And it's hard for people when they're suffering from all that trauma to get out of that, because that has been coloring their whole life.
yeah, it has been. And like also because like they've waited so long to talk about it often. So there's just like so many stories and like so many like, things to share, and they want to connect with people who can relate to it. And so like there's this burning desire to like get it out and also to like find so many others like
Right.
that are like them. So like it's like freeing of like, wow, you mean you also experience this? Like
Right.
that can be amazing. But then what happens is like it can take on a life of its own, and it just like takes over their whole
Right.
future. And that not necessarily is healthy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they should, be extra cautious about that.
Yeah. So I think like we got into that conversation is because you said sometimes in therapy, the work of being vulnerable makes people want it more,
Yeah.
and like where to find it, or like how to start being more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. But, then again, like I don't believe that I'm the type of therapist who pushes people away from their families. Maybe it's because I work with young adults more and it's like not possible.
No, right. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, no, yeah. No, I just feel like
maybe so. We're not
no,
sure.
of course not. And no, I don't think any therapist really pushes clients
Yeah.
away. I think that sometimes though, there's like this, people have this like opinion that therapists push people away from their close ones or their
Mhm.
friends. And I think it's because they're learning certain things in therapy
Mhm.
about being vulnerable and about healthy relationships. And suddenly they look into their life and they're like, hold on one second.
Right.
I don't want to be in relationships that aren't healthy
Right.
anymore.
I don't think I've ever told anybody like, you should cut this person out.
Yeah,
or
I
you
don't
shouldn't
think any
be.
I mean, maybe people do
Yeah,
do that.
I think that there are.
They do that, but you shouldn't be
There
telling
are.
anyone what to do
Right.
and not to do it. Yeah.
Exactly.
But I'm saying that I think that a lot of times a client is left with an awareness, and then that leads them to,
To make the choices for themselves of like who they want and who they don't want.
I think that,
But not always can you choose though. Like that's the thing. Like let's say you decide that a parent is toxic. Like you can't necessarily just move out.
Right.
Like if you have a sibling who's toxic, like you can't just like not like interact with them. Especially like if you're sharing a room with them. Like
Right.
you're not going to be like, okay, we're changing our rooms. Like when you don't have enough rooms in the house.
exactly.
So like there's certain things that you have to learn to like live with that toxicity or make more emotional boundaries like we've spoken in the past. Like just because you're physically with somebody like in their proximity, it doesn't mean that you can't have boundaries with
Right.
them.
Exactly.
But yeah, but it definitely like my heart goes out to like those people who like on the one hand like they see what it tastes like and what it feels like to be in a vulnerable relationship or where they can be open, and then they go back and they're not able to be in their
Right.
lives. Like that's a really hard place to be.
Yeah. For people who do feel like they do have, a space to start being vulnerable, but they're like, wait, so how do I even do this?
Mhm.
Right? Like kind of leave like the listeners with like one tip on how to like start being vulnerable.
I kind of like, for me, vulnerability is like you have to feel it and experience it in order to know it. It's not something that you can like talk about. Like lots of times like we can feel like we're being vulnerable because we're talking about vulnerability, but we're not actually vulnerable.
Right.
Like I think vulnerable is something that like in a therapy room, like I always say like do, don't tell. Like do it, experience it, feel it. And then afterwards, like I'll sum it up and say, well, that's what we just did.
Mm.
Because like if you don't go through it, you don't really know what you're
Right.
talking about. It's like how like a person who is blind, like they don't know what things look like because they've never seen it. Until you see it, do you actually know it? So you can describe it, but like you can't really feel it
Right.
until you're in it. And so I think with vulnerability, like when you're in a, let's say, vulnerable relationship, like if you're speaking in therapy and you're talking openly, or you're in a vulnerable relationship with a friend, like then you can say like, oh, like that's what you're talking
Right.
about. And so like rather than just like talking about it, do it.
Yeah.
Or feel it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So today we spoke a lot about vulnerability and like how it comes up and what it feels like, and how a person can, move a little bit more towards it and to test it out and to feel it for themselves.
Yeah, I really liked the concept of that comedy can be a form of vulnerability as well, and that meeting someone with laughter and sharing a comedy situation similar can be a form of empathy.
Yeah. Yeah, that was actually new for me. I didn't
Right.
realize that until like, it's like
As
the
we were
aha
talking,
moment as we
yeah.
were talking, like that really unpacked. And
Yeah, so that was really interesting. And I also think it's important to like reiterate that like the reason sometimes it holds us back from being vulnerable is because of shame that comes up for us. And the antidote to that is empathy. So the antidote to that is being vulnerable to share your shame.
right, to then get rid of the shame, or to be okay with the shame, to show that, like, because at the end of the day, like, we're not really perfect and we all have stuff, and some of the shame is like societal and some of the shame is like individual and unique, and we need to understand like what's holding us back from being vulnerable and then who to go out and to speak to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.